This salon, like all of them that occur in Levita, are co-sponsored by the Huerfano County Historical Society and the Levita Public Library. And we're privileged and we're honored to have our today's speaker, Bob Kennemer, talk about what is basically the nucleus of what became Levita, and that is the history of Francisco Fort. Bob moved to Levita 35 years ago. He immediately began learning all about the community, all about Huerfano County, surrounding areas, and including Francisco Fort. But now, as current director of the Francisco Fort Museum, he is completely immersed in that environment and has learned a lot more about present state and the origin of the fort. And so, with that, please help me welcome Bob Kennemer.
I just got goosebumps because I'm scared and I'm nervous. This presentation I'm going to give, I've never given, at least not in a format like this. And all of our visitors that come to the fort, we give them about you can do a self-guided tour. We can give you a map of the fort, and on one page it gives you a little overview of the fort and our buildings, and on the back it has a map of how to get around. And some people just want to go guide themselves. Others, people, if you want, will give you 5, depending on your level of interest, if you have little kids. Unlike Connor, who comes all the time and never needs any disciplinary action. He can lead a tour through the museum and stuff. But if there's little kids, you know, they might want a 5-minute presentation. If we have people who really just want to learn about it, we'll give them as much time and we'll do a guided tour. So you have those options when you come to the Fort Museum. But I'm also nervous because, again, I've never given a long presentation like this, and I hope you'll have, it's 3 hours. You know. There will be a bathroom break. But less than 400 slides. I cut it down. So the other reason I'm nervous is you might have, I don't know if you guys ever saw this shirt we had made. It's hard to read from back there, but it says, "May the fort be with you." And I know that sounds familiar because this guy named George Lucas stole that idea from me, back in the 70s. And I've been in a lawsuit with him since then. However, since Disney bought the rights to Star Wars, it's far more complicated. Now I'm in the midst of suing George Lucas, Lucasfilms, and Disney. It's a tough life. But anyway, that aside, let's start on the fort. Make it work. Where's George when I need him?
That's what you get for defaming Disney.
I'm pushing the buttons. You have to be.
Oh, it's just your laptop.
It's my laptop.
Your laptop.
Yeah, I'll push the lights for you.
I'll push your buttons for me.
My laptop being the fort's. So, we're going to start with the Colonel. He's the man. Colonel John Mace Francisco was born in Virginia and started coming out west when he was about 19 years old. He was born in 1820 and was out here. His family had plantations and were slave owners in Virginia, and they moved their operation to Missouri at some point, and right around that time he decided to come out west. Spent about 6 months out here and really did quite well. Brought just all kinds of teams of products and goods from Missouri out on the Santa Fe Trail. And of course at that time that was kind of right near the peak, or the end of the peak of the Santa Fe Trail, and as far as how busy it was. And so, but he did well. He made a lot of money in just 6 months. But he ultimately got called back to the farm, to the plantation, and ultimately his father died and he took over the operation for a while. But he wasn't really into the plantation business. He had some health issues. He ended up going to Wisconsin for a while. For health reasons, it didn't work. He ended up coming back out west again to basically New Mexico. And with that, I'm going to look at a few notes. So anyway, he So he came here, was actually in Mexico and New Mexico, and by the way, this was the New Mexico territory at the time that he was first here. It wasn't even Colorado territory. And anyway, he ended up getting work as a sutler, and a sutler is basically somebody who supplies the government with goods. In this case, he was supplying a variety of forts with goods for the forts, and that would be everything from a soldier's basic needs, like personal items for their days off, to meat, wood, fabric, soap, and things for forts. Because back in that day, the forts were almost like a little town, and of course, like Levita, towns grew out of these forts. So they had laundry facilities, and they had laundry ladies, and they had housekeepers, and they had to have seamstresses and a blacksmith. So they were, a whole little community, and you needed a store. And so Francisco was doing that, and he was doing well with it. He actually was quite the businessman. He's credited with, he had a place in Denver. He had what's alleged to be the very first permanent home in Pueblo. He got around, and he hung out with some pretty cool people, which we'll hear about soon. Next slide, please. So, pop quiz. Okay. What famous quote did Francisco say upon first laying eyes on the Cachara Valley? A, not bad.
Yeah.
B, pretty much okay for me. Henry, we're going to need more money. Wowzers. C, those two peaks remind me. F, this is paradise enough for me, or all of the above. Does anybody know? Well, yeah, I'm sure he said all of those things. So, anyway, I just think, we're lucky that these quotes were saved through time. And although wowzers, I think, is not used much anymore. Next slide, please. So there was a cast of characters out here when Francisco came. He ended up working, and we'll go into this more a little bit later. He ended up working at Fort Massachusetts, which preceded Fort Garland. And when Fort Massachusetts, I don't know if you know the brief history. I'm not going to steal too much of it. I think, Sandy, you're going to be talking about Fort Mass in the future, right?
Yes.
Down the road. So I'm not going to say too much about it, but basically, the Army blew it, and they built it on a swamp, and in the winter. And then when the spring came around, and like the bugs and the trees and the mud and the goop, it's like, this really sucks. Was the term that they used. And so they finally decided to move the fort, and it was a wooden fort too. So they moved it, and they created what's now Fort Garland. Kit Carson was the commander at Fort Garland, and the colonel worked for Kit Carson. We have a fabulous picture we just had restored in the museum of Kit Carson. Fun fact to know and tell, this impresses people at the bars, Johnny Carson is related to Kit Carson, just so you know. Yes, true. Fun fact to know and tell. Tom Tobin was famous because he was a frontiersman here. He knew the colonel. He was the guy who ultimately decided to go after the bounty on the Espinosa gang. The Espinosas were a group of guys, relatives mainly, who basically didn't like the way the Mexican-American War settled out, and they decided to go on some rampages. And there's obviously, like just with any history, there's two sides to the story, but they did a lot of rough things in this area. We even have a fictional book by a fellow who comes and performs here. John Chandler. What's that? John Chandler, yes. He has a great fictional book where he fictionalizes, all the characters in it are real. It's Francisco and so forth, other people, but the Espinosas get a different name, but ultimately they were marauding through Canyon City in this area, killing people. They killed over 40 people. And Tom Tobin was famous for, he hunted them down, killed them to show proof that he killed them. He brought the heads to the state capitol to prove that he killed them, and they still refused to pay him the bounty. He never got the money for hunting them down and killing them. Back then, Chief Ouray, who was one of the Indian chiefs in the area, and his wife Chapita were in this area. We have stories of them staying, not maybe necessarily here at the fort, but we know they interacted with the colonel. But there was a guy named Tom Sharp who lived over in the Gardner area, had a toll road. And we have stories of Ouray hanging out with Tom Sharp. And literally, these guys were buddies. Ouray would bring horses over, and they'd have horse races, because Tom Sharp was an internationally renowned horse breeder, even sold horses to the King and Queen of England. And so Ouray would come over, and he'd stay with Sharp, and they'd hang out, and they'd have betting and so forth like that. They even once tested, Ouray decided to test Tom Sharp's reliability and trustworthiness, he had some of his men try to bribe him to fix a horse race, and Sharp wouldn't do it. He did it, and that's when they became good buds, because he said, I can trust this guy, we can bet together. So, but there was that other guy, which you might have heard about, Kaniache, which John Manos has a fabulous presentation on. And Kaniache is a help. I've always heard it pronounced from John, but we had a group of youths here, and I kept saying Kaniache, they did not know what I meant. And they pronounced it a couple of different ways. But the difference between Ure and Chipeta, they were kind of known as, Ure was a peace chief. And his job, quite often, was going back and working with people in D.C. To settle different disputes and land acquisitions or sales or taking of land. And some youths really respect Ure and Chipeta for what they did, other ones despise them because they feel he gave everything away. But I was looking up some things on Chipeta, or Ure the other day. One of his famous lines was saying, negotiating with the U.S. government is over land is kind of like after you filled a buffalo with arrows, going to it and ask him, so what do you want to do? He said, you just give up. He says, you really can't do anything. You're out of control. You're in their hands. So, and of course, Kaniache, we'll hear about him a little bit later. On more than one occasion, Kaniache brought several Indians who ended up Utes who surrounded the fort, and they were causing hostility both at the fort and in the settlements around the fort. The Bent brothers who started Bent's Fort, Charles and Williams, there's some strong connections there because Bent's old fort was probably the premier trading post on the Santa Fe Trail out west. Charles ultimately got killed in the Taos Uprising, and ultimately the fort was burned to the ground. And there's a replica of Bent's Fort. It's a restaurant outside of Denver called the Fort Restaurant, if people want to go see what it looks like. But we also have a replica out where it used to be, out in La Junta. So, and the same guy that was the backer of the Bent brothers, Saran St. Vrain, who was basically the land guy here, he was also the land guy and a business partner with Colonel Francisco. And so there's a connection. He was a guy who helped the Bent brothers get established with their land and their fort, and then he helped the colonel in that the colonel bought land, and Dager bought land from Saran St. Vrain. The Hamilton brothers were some of the early settlers, and I put them in here only because there's some great stories about them, and they, all the way to this present day, the Hamilton family is still having an impact on our fort. I'm going to tell you about that in a little bit. Uncle Billy was famous because he was the first postmaster in La Veta. He had a famous way of how he distributed the mail. The mail bags would come in the lobby of the post office, which was at the fort. It was called Spanish Peaks. He dumped the mail on the floor, and people could come sort out their own mail. Government worker, right? Next slide, please. Again, Lucian Maxwell, if you've read any of Nancy Christopherson's article, she did a great story on him about a year ago, the Maxwell land grant. Uncle Dick Wooten, the Wooten family still down in the Raton and Trinidad area. A lot of what is right adjacent to Pinion Canyon Maneuver Site, that land belongs to the Wootens. Thomas Boggs of Boggsville, there's another great museum out in Boggsville. Charles Autobes was a fellow who ended up building a fort up on the Arkansas River. All these guys were connected with Colonel Francisco. And by the way, Colonel Francisco, that's an honorary title. He wasn't an actual military colonel. He's a colonel like Colonel Sanders is a colonel. It's a courtesy title. So, and I'm Sergeant Bob. Anyway, Albert Gallatin Boone, who was the grandson of Daniel Boone, was another guy who hung out with the colonel. And the town of Boone, Colorado is named after him. We have some artifacts from Mr. Boone in the museum. And again, Saran St. Vrain and Cornelio Vigil, they're the guys who they were two of the very largest property owners in United States history. They basically owned most of southeastern Colorado and parts of northern New Mexico. And so, like I said, the colonel and Dager ended up going to St. Vrain. They were business partners in various ventures already, and they decided to buy the Cachar Valley from them, or from Mr. Well, Vigil was killed along with Mr. Bent was killed in the Taos Uprising, so then Saran St. Vrain was the lone partner, and he's the one the colonel did business with. So let's go to the next one. So these are the partners. That's Henry Dager, There's a Dager Reservoir actually, by the way, it's a French name. He was a French-Canadian from Quebec. And it's actually pronounced Dagra, or Dague. And if you get it and do it on your phone, you'll hear different pronunciations, but Dager is how we say it. And Hiram Vasquez, I personally think he is probably the more colorful of the three. This guy has an amazing history. We could do a whole program on him. And I'll throw in a few little tidbits, but he was an astounding young man, and he saved the fort on a couple occasions too, or at least made attempts to. So those were his two major partners. Dager was the first, was a judge. A lot of people refer to him as Henry Dager. Dager's house still stands here in Levita. I think it's for sale right now. And he's buried in the Levita Cemetery. So next slide, please, sir. So back to James Gillespie Hamilton, and I said how he's affecting to his family, is still affecting us to this day. He and his brother were two of the very first residents of the fort. They decided to move their cattle operation from Missouri out here. And so they lived in the fort, and then they bought land from the colonel. And I'm going to talk about how much land they bought and what happened with that in a little bit. But at any rate, he came out here and he was very successful. This guy has, well, let me jump ahead. These are his relatives. These are the Campbell twins, and it's Maria and Martha, can't remember the last name. But anyway, it'll come to me. It's not Hamilton, Campbell. They live in Boulder, and that family over the years has donated a huge amount of artifacts and money to the museum. And these two girls were born in Levita. So Hamilton's daughter was married to a fellow named Campbell. Mr. Campbell died when the girls were 4. And they had an older sister named Aggie, or Agnes. She just died 2 years ago and is buried in the Levita Cemetery. And my friend Ruth here, she and I went up and had the chance to meet these two women because they called one day and said, you know, we're like in our 90s and our sister Aggie is in a nursing home with really bad Alzheimer's, and we have more things we want to give to the museum. I was talking to them and they said, I said, so like what? They said, well, we have an entire house of materials we would like to donate to the museum in Boulder. And this is old Boulder. But their mother tried to make a living after the father died, and she couldn't make a living here. She tried and it was just not working. She tried living on the ranch and running the ranch. She came to town, couldn't find work here. The mother took the 3 girls to Boulder, and she became a maid at the University of Colorado, CU Boulder. She put all 3 girls through college, and the twins ended up working as librarians at CU Library on different floors. We worked together for like 30 years. We hardly ever saw each other. Because they never married, and they're still together, they're still alive, and they're totally together mentally, and again, they own an entire house of stuff. We already have some of it was brought down. They paid for a moving van to bring it down, and we have it in storage, and our goal right now, and they also donated, by the way, $10,000 to help us create a new exhibit. To create that exhibit, we have an old steam engine that was, and this isn't a train steam engine, this is a steam engine that was used to power the creamery in Walsenburg. And that creamery, that's how they made power back then. You didn't always have power sources like power plants. You made your own power. And that's what they powered the creamery with. Well, we have that in the museum, and it still functions. But we have to get it outside, and it's big. It weighs lots, about 8 or 9 feet long, about 6 to 7 feet tall, about 3 or 4 feet wide. And it's operational, but you don't want to operate it inside of the building. So we want to move it out, and this is the goal of the museum. And we're going to make a new exhibit of it, and then turn the room it's in into a new exhibit with as much of the Campbell twins' possessions as we can. We're talking their feather mattress. They got their first new bed since they were 4 years old in Boulder, and we have their feather mattress that they slept on their entire lives. It's amazing. We have stereos. We have their clothes from when they were little girls, matching outfits. We have records, books, china, like all this stuff. It's a house of stuff. It's amazing. Next slide, please, sir. So, but wait, what happened before? Like I said, the colonel just didn't happen here. Things happened for us. He was still trading on the Santa Fe Trail, making money, doing well, and he got this name as being a great sutler. And a lot of people also think the colonel was notorious because the sutlers, as a group, were kind of notorious for overcharging the government. It's kind of like the $600 toilet seat we heard about. These guys did the same things, apparently. But in the case of Fort, so this is some pictures of Fort Mass. That's a drawing of it. Again, it was a wooden fort. I don't believe there's any trees like that grow in Colorado naturally, but some poetic license, artistic license. But the colonel, and this is where they've been doing a dig, a guy named Dr. Goddard over at Adams State. He and his son have been doing an enormous amount of research. As a matter of fact, John Van Kuren, who's here, has gone over, and he's the guy who runs the Heritage Center in Walsenburg for the Historical Society. Anyway, he has a lot of information on that and has been on some of the digs. And this is a photo of it. You can see Mount Blanca in the background. But the colonel actually had a store attached to the fort. It was his own little building, and attached to the fort, and he had corrals and so forth, where he could have meat and stuff for the fort. Next slide, please. And then, as I said, they built it on a swamp, so they moved it to present-day Fort Garland, which is now a state history museum. And I want to do a little bit of bragging on our fort. We have people from Fort Garland that come over and help with programs here. We have a school educator. She's a school teacher who comes over in the summer and does kids programs with us. And she said, and she works at Fort Garland Museum, and she just went back into teaching full time. But she said, I really like coming to your museum because you guys have artifacts. Ours is basically a bunch of rebuilt buildings. We're the only original adobe fort left standing in Colorado, and it is full of materials, all donated by local people, which we'll talk about in a little while. So I think we should be very proud because we're part of an association of museums, the San Luis Valley Museum Association. Even though we're not in the San Luis Valley, it's the closest we have to being in a museum association. And I meet with these other directors all the time, and I can tell you unequivocally, we have the largest, most complete, and amazing collection of any of the 14 museums that are in that association. So we should be proud of that. All local citizens doing, by the way. So next, sir. So, oh yeah, we were talking about Francisco Fort. So this is a nice drawing of the fort, and this is an old photo from 1890 by a guy named O.T. Davis, who was famous for photographing the San Luis Valley and this area, and has some great books by him. But let me try to describe, we don't have any pictures of what the fort looked like in the beginning. So Madeline, I'm going to have you hand out these. I might not have enough to go around to everybody if you can share some, but that's a map of our grounds. And we won't need it for a second, but we'll get those around. But imagine this. So the fort originally was a totally enclosed facility. And again, I think most of you people look like you're, if I run my glasses on, but I saw you in here. You're mainly locals. You probably know this was not a military fort. Just like the colonel wasn't a military colonel. This was a settlement fort, just like Ben's fort, trading post fort. And but it still acted as a fortified plaza for protection for the people who were moving here. When Mr. Hamilton came here, he lived in the fort for protection until he could get his own farm and ranch built. If there was Indian trouble or bandits, a lot of times everybody would come to the fort for protection, and they could stay here. So it had a wall. The fort, basically the three wings of the fort made up three of the walls. Across here was a palisade or stockade fence, they call it, the big, like 8 to 10 foot spike poles. And where this gate, this is the east wing, which is directly outside this wall. There's a gap between here and here, and that's where there was a gate. Now the roofs were flat and made out of dirt back then, and there was a parapet that went all the way around on three sides so that volunteer citizens could shoot from up there if they came under any kind of attack. And this is the site of the first well in Veta. And so, they have plenty of foodstuffs. This is part of what we call the south wing. The south wing had a 60-foot warehouse, 60-foot long warehouse that was full of grains and goods because that supplied what was right here, and you'll see that on your maps. If you look at the east wing connected to the gift shop, you'll see there's a general store there. So people coming through, they were settling, either just passing through and they just needed supplies. You could buy everything from food to tobacco, to farm equipment, to fabric for clothes, all kinds of things in this little store. We start our tours pretty much in that store because that would have been most people were coming here. They were coming here, they were passing through, they needed supplies, so they were coming here to buy land. So let's talk a little bit about the land. the colonel and Dager met with Saran St. Vrain, came over here, said all those things that we looked at, and they said, okay, we'll buy the land. And they bought essentially the entire Cachar Valley. So imagine to the ridgeline of the Spanish Peaks in Cachar Pass, to the ridgeline of the Sangre de Cristos in the back, all the way almost over to the Huerfano River, over by Highway 69 area, and east towards Walsenburg. We don't know the exact boundaries, probably about 8 to 10 miles to the east. The main goal was that they wanted to have all this fertile bottomland so they could have crops and ranches. But everybody also had a right, what they call a timber right. You could go and harvest timber up in the mountains, and you were allowed, based on your acreage, you were allowed to go harvest so much wood so that you could use it for everything from firewood or buildings. And that's kind of how the deal worked. And Dager, when he came here, he was kind of the colonel's go-to guy. They were partners, but the colonel didn't live here at first. Dager did. He and some other guys built 4 cabins right in this area because the river's only a block away, so there was water. They had no well. So there was water nearby, game nearby. They built cabins. We've heard different stories on this. The one I was taught by Nancy Christopherson, by the way, if I'm making mistakes, it's Nancy's fault because I learned all this from her, other than the solid humor. She's funny in a different way. But anyway, so supposedly Dager went back over to the San Luis Valley, hired some workers from there, and went down to Taos and hired Taos Pueblo Indians, and they came up and they built the adobe, made the adobe bricks to make the fort. And that was 1861 to 1862. This wing, the east wing, was the first wing, and it opened up in 1862 with that store, and these other rooms were basically rental rooms. If you were coming here to buy land, you needed a place to stay the night, so then you could go out with your real estate person from Bachman called Colonel John Francisco, and you could go out and look at land, and you do a deal. So at any rate, then they ultimately built this wing, and the colonel, you see a covered porch right here, that's where the colonel lived. He had the largest of the quarters. Most of these rooms are only about, maybe 16 feet wide by 16 feet. You basically had a window, a door, and a source of heat, a fireplace or a stove. So a lot of things happened outside. Ultimately, though, you'll see now these are shingle roof, metal roof, and so forth, but they're all flat now, and that southern wing where that warehouse was ultimately fell apart. It was not rebuilt, and what's left of that south wing is a private home. It's been a private home since the late 1800s to the early 1900s. It's now owned by a couple out of Texas, and he's a retired oil and gas geologist. Their name is Mr. and Mrs. Cook. And he's an avid historian. He's done presentations here on the Magna Carta. Really amazing guy, and his wife's a retired school teacher. So we still have the 2 wings and most of the south wing on the fort. So let's go a little bit further, Tony. So here's another photo of the fort. This is Main Street. Looks the same. It's full of dirt. So that's one of the towers that warn if there's a flood. But anyway, the fort kind of went through a lot of changes. It was the hub, and we're going to get into it in a little bit because several things happened though. This is a photo probably from the turn of the century, a little bit later, because you can see that's actually a power line. This is a tree the colonel planted back here in 1878. It's still there. It now has a span of over 55 feet wide. It's what they call a champion tree. It's really an amazing tree, and it still stands. A lot of people said it was a hanging tree, that 17 men were, hung from that tree. We don't have any real evidence of that, although we do have evidence that when the train came, and it's hard to see in this photo, but you'll see a dark line kind of right here. That's where the narrow gauge railroad came in Levita. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But there was a telegraph pole here, and one time when the train pulled up, there was a guy hanging from it. And I thought, what a great way to greet tourists. Welcome to Levita. Don't get out of line. And so that's one of our stories. But we don't have any evidence that people got hung from the tree, really. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Tony. More pictures of the fort. So you can see the trees grew, things got better. The fort ultimately did start falling into disrepair and kind of bouncing a little bit. By the time of World War II, a lot of the wings were being rented out as residence for returning soldiers, and they were basically apartments. and they ended up connecting, because these rooms were so small, they had connecting doors, but people, they put in running water and so forth, and men actually lived in those. And Doug Bergosh was the one that told me that he can remember playing in the fort as a little kid. I bet you maybe even, and then some other people might have come, they often called it the Dobies, is what they called it. It wasn't even called the fort anymore because it was falling into such disrepair. And I'll give you a little bit more chronology of the fort, how it got to that point in a little bit. Go ahead, Tony, let's look at some more photos of it. So this is another photo of the fort. Again, you can, that's after the, I guess part of the wing has actually come off over there. And by the way, that wing, once the railroad got here, that wing that had been a warehouse became Levita's first post office. And that also was the train depot. So let's talk a little bit about what happened up until prior to 1876. When the colonel was here, Levita was basically never more than about 200 people within the square limit. We didn't even have town limits per se. It wasn't an official incorporated town. But in 1876, three things happened. The narrow gauge railroad came down from Denver. General Palmer came down pretty much following I-25 corridor, and they were going to build a railway over Levita Pass, Old Levita Pass, to Fort Garland and on to Alamosa and so on. So when the railroad arrived here, that was 1876, that same year Levita became a state, or excuse me, Colorado became a state, and Levita became an incorporated town. And so things changed overnight. Less than 200 people here, there were a couple of stores outside of town, or outside of the fort, a few settlements, but basically just imagine this fort and a handful of buildings nearby. In less than a year, actually in only a few months, all of a sudden there was 600 railroad workers here, and they needed places to live and things to do. So 5 liquor licenses were let the first year, and different other buildings came up where they could have fun. And so, I know billiards is what I'm talking about. So anyway, so a lot of different things happened. If you guys get a chance afterwards, you'll see, come up and look at the map. What's now Raya Street. So here's the fort. It's hard to see for you guys, but and you'll have this. It's even hard to tell on your map. But this is the plaza of the fort. Levita is basically 1 square mile. So that's Levita. This is where the railroad came, literally right behind this building. So behind the library and in front of the fort, the railroad came and kind of went a little bit past the old Episcopal church. That's what now an Airbnb, I think, Sandy, right? Sandy's around here somewhere. And did you guys find some rail tracks underneath it, is what I heard?
There are tracks in there.
Yeah, so they actually have part of the narrow gauge railroad was there. And the narrow gauge only lasted here about not even 15, 20 years. Ultimately, a standard gauge went through. But narrow gauges were great because they could go up steeper terrain and make sharper curves. And Levita kind of became famous when the train came here because when that train went over Levita Pass, that was the highest rail in the world. And people liked the bragging rights. So tourists even back then, like, I went to the Empire State Building and I went to the Matterhorn. Well, you could say went over the highest railroad pass in the world. And so people liked that. It was really cool. So we had tourists coming. It really changed Levita. Up here, if you cross over the railroad, this is the route that goes over to Fort Garland. On either side of this, we were just talking about this with Edna Schmidt, there were stockyards along here. The Kennemer barn over on Francisco Street was where a lot of times farmers could come and could put their goods in there to be stored until they could get loaded onto the train. And that barn still stands as part of one of our historic sites. So this, basically the town kind of grew from the plaza and the fort towards the railroad. And then of course, the rest of it grew. And this is again this is the very first official legal plat of Levita. And Main Street was called Locust, and Raya Street was called Front Street. So, but there were several hotels and offices and buildings and stores right there. Next slide, Tony. Just some other photos. I don't know, maybe I put that in twice, but keep going. We'll go a little bit more. And this is a photo with the narrow gauge right here. And it might be a little hard to see, but if you look on here, it'll say hotel. And Andrew, Colonel's brother, Andrew Francisco, came out and lived here. And he had a wife, and they had children. The Colonel never had children in wedlock. He did have 2 children out of wedlock, which I'll talk about in a moment. But anyway, Andrew actually lived right next to the colonel's quarters, were right here in the corner. Andrew and his family lived there. Andrew ran a hotel of just uncomparable size. It was one room. What a great hotel. When I see a room, you're in the room. So that, and then there's another sign over here. It's kind of hard to read in this slide, but it's a satellite store of a business in Pueblo that opened up a branch down in La Veta, because La Veta was happening. And they're getting ready for a political rally here, and these poles were set up because they're going to, when the train came, they were going to put up big banners for the politicians that were coming through. So even back then, people did stupid things for next slide, please. So a couple other old pictures of the fort, just looking at it from different perspectives. Our lovely box elder trees, all naughty and nasty, ultimately got cut down and made into firewood. But again, this is our east wing. We now have metal roofs on here, and by the way, we are going to be getting some new roofs on. We had a new roof put on the CAPS building and it blew off already, so it happened a little over a week ago. Next one's Tony. Some older ones. This is that gate that I talked about. This porch was added on in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The colonel was no longer living here. Well, actually, he had that added on, and then it became an enclosed porch. But then this was rented out as a home for people. And that gate went right here. And again, the roofs were flat, and that was the only way in and out of the fort. Next slide, sir. So this is that map that you guys have. And I thought we'd just kind of go over. We're going to get into some more recent history of it. But so let's see if I can find where I am on this thing, where we are. I do this every day in the summer. Okay. So what we want to look at, so the general store. So here's Main Street, library. This is the Memorial Walk. This is our gift shop, and you go into the general store. And again, then there's 3 rooms here. And this is kind of how the museum, the fort got turned into a museum. There was a guy named Joe Ely. Joe Ely was a taxidermist and a hunting guide in the area. And he had literally hundreds upon hundreds of stuffed animals. And he and other people had been approaching a woman named Murray Daniels. Remember I said the colonel never had kids? His brother had some kids, and one of them was named Murray Daniels. And at any rate, she inherited the fort. Her mother, let me go back a little bit. The colonel had willed the fort to his brother, but his brother died before the colonel. And so it ended up going to the colonel, or his brother's wife, Andrew's wife. And then it went to Murray Daniels. She was approached by several people, say, hey, maybe we could turn this into some kind of a museum. And ultimately she agreed to do it. And in the 1950s, mid-1950s, the Utt family was here, and Mr. Utt agreed to form the Huerfano County Historical Society, of which the president, Sharon Vazani, is here today. And so they formed a historical society. They raised money, and they basically fixed up this wing, and they filled it up full of stuffed animals for Mr. Ely, of which we still have a lot. Unfortunately, over the years, a previous director went to a class of the museum, went to a class and learned that the off-gassing from those animals, they used some toxic chemicals like formaldehyde, could be dangerous, and she threw away almost all of those stuffed animals. We only had a handful left. So we even have some on loan. We have a really great bear hide on loan from the Steffen family. And but anyway, it was so popular that it was decided to turn the rest of the fort into a museum. And so basically in the 1950s, the fort was turned into a museum. It was no longer going to be used as residence. When this wing opened up, they sort of had a silent opening. It was really popular. Hundreds of people showed up. And then at that same time, the Territorial Daughters were throwing a big party to celebrate this wing opening up as a museum. And they were already acquiring from Murray Daniels, who had deeded this to the Historical Society in the town, to become a museum. They were also working on what was the colonel's quarters to become another part of the museum. And then ultimately, this wing and the west wing all became what we now know as Francisco Fort Museum. and then later on, various other structures that were either here or they were moved here to complete what we now know as the fort campus. We have 8 buildings, including a teepee, on the fort grounds, and that's what you see on your little map. Next slide, sir. So again, this is a kind of a replica of that map, not quite as good, but this is how the river used to run through Veta. And all these little oxbows you see, that was a problem because when the water came down in wet years, it would, instead of following that channel, because it's so windy, it would just flood right across and go here. So it was starting to flood out homes and properties, and more importantly, it was flooding the railroad. So the railroad didn't like that, so they ultimately rerouted the river, made the channel kind of more what it is now. Kind of the same idea of why we cleaned it up after the fire, by getting all that debris out of there. Now, ideally, the water will predominantly stay in that channel if we get flooded, and that's kind of what they were trying to do by straightening the river. Next one, Mr. Tony. So here's a few things that are coming up, and we're going to bounce around a little bit more, but we've been extending the season of the fort. The fort used to only be open from Memorial Day weekend to Labor Day weekend. Since I've been director, I've been promoting the idea of extending the season. We now open the first week, the first Thursday in May, and we close after Oktoberfest. We're open through the Saturday of Oktoberfest. In the off-season, I'm still around for a while, and I sometimes do private tours to different museum groups. We do school programs and things like that. So, but just mark your calendars. May 7th is when we're open. In May, we're only open 3 days a week, Thursday, Fridays, and Saturdays. And the same thing, once we close after Labor Day, we go to 3 days a week. Other than that, we're open Tuesday through Saturday. And again, sometimes on weekends, we do other tours as well. We have the Watoria Heritage Festival. I think I saw Sandy Dolak come in, and she might be able to mention it. It was a huge success for us last year. It was our largest crowd. We had what? Over 800 people came to that event.
That was just one day.
In one day. And then we have Fort Francisco Days. We were trying to do it always on the 3rd weekend of July, but we've kind of moved it because we had some really important entertainers we wanted to get this year. So we're taking it, we've changed the dates for it, and it's going to be July 25th and 26th. The 25th is going to be more, we're trying to get it more like it used to be. It's going to be a celebration of the old timers and the old way of life here. And so we're going to focus a lot more on history and heritage. On the 26th, we're going to be having a little bit, there will be entertainment and other things, vendors and things on the 25th. On the 26th, we're looking more at educational programs, probably some happening here in the library, various presentations, historical presentations, and some performances too. Let's see what happened here. I didn't get it on here, but I want to tell a little story that should be part of this. David Inke, which a lot of you guys might know, a long-time Veta resident, is a world-class luthier. He repairs guitars and builds guitars. You'll see some of his items over in the new gallery in the park side. And at any rate, he came to me one day and said, I could restore these instruments, all of our stringed instruments. So we used money this past year, and David has restored all of our stringed instruments, but we have one giant dulcimer, which is probably about 2/3 the size of that screen. It's like an old door that somebody made into a musical instrument. And so anyway, he's fixed them all up. They all work. He's got history on a lot of them, and we had some history on them. And we're going to do a performance this year as a concert, maybe fundraiser, where we'll get different local musicians who will come in and will actually perform on those instruments. So it's really exciting. They look beautiful, by the way. They're quite amazing. Let's see. I have another handout that I'll let Manuel pass around. A lot of you guys might have heard, a few years ago, we got a grant, the county got a grant through a company called Travel Stories, and they made an app that you can download onto your phone that you can then, even if you don't have cell service, which I know shockingly is sometimes spotty in our area, you can download it onto your phone, and you can drive the Highway of Legends, and it'll give you the history, the culture, the geology, all kinds of stuff. It's really well done. And it was so popular, matter of fact, the company Travel Stories who does it, it's in their top 3 right behind Yellowstone Travel Stories and Glacier National Park Travel Stories. So we're getting a lot of visitation out of that. And we recently, you might have read in the paper, we've got a couple of different grants. We have a grant to turn that walking history brochure, which was done by our local Historic Preservation Committee. So right now in Levita, you can take yourself on a guided tour using that brochure and the metal plaques that the Historical Preservation Committee has put on various buildings. We have 22 historic structures that are already noted. They're in that brochure. The grant we got was designed, we only had so much money. So we split it up between Walsenburg is getting some of that money, and they're creating a walking tour because they don't have anything other than Carolyn Newman, and it's all in her head. And so we're going to try to form an actual walking tour like what we have. And also Bruce Johnson helped create a walking tour of historic sites and buildings in Cachara. So that'll probably be coming out this spring, April, or May. We're going to continue with paranormal research programs. It's amazing, the most popular hits we get on a museum are related to paranormal stuff. It's like, I check our Instagram site and our Facebook page and stuff. The main thing, and all these different paranormal groups, they've heard about the paranormal researchers, so they're all jumping on. Last year I had 5 different groups wanting to do paranormal research at the museum.
Did they study you?
Yeah, I scared them away. And it can be tough because a lot of times I got to stay up all night with these guys, because you can only do paranormal research in the dark, for some reason.
I don't know about that.
What's that?
It doesn't seem that paranormal activity would only occur in the dark.
Well, apparently that's a rule of ghosts. Except for movies, they sometimes are in the daytime. But that's popular. Again, I mentioned that Steve exhibit, the Campbell twins. We also have a grant, $250,000 grant to renovate the east wing. It suffered a lot of damage because when we went to pitched roofs, the water and snow slough off and then it gets up against the adobe foundation and it's eroding away. So we've been doing some repairs with David Steffen, who I mentioned earlier. We sent him to Adobe School a couple years ago, and he has been doing repairs in the building, but it needs major renovation. And we're going to go to a shake shingle roof, and we're going to redo the chimneys. And it's great. Unfortunately, we'll probably have to lose the entire east wing this summer. We'll have to pull everything out and find places to put it. So if anybody wants your house to become a museum for the summer, say, hell, come over. Tony will do it. He's got a lot of it. So at any rate, a petting zoo. Not really, I put that in first. I like to impersonate voices, and I call up my staff and I ask them, yeah, you got a petting zoo at that there museum? And I go on, and I can run them for like a half hour, really pissing them off, trying to make sure that I can come see the petting zoo I heard about. So we also love volunteers. If anybody ever wants to volunteer, and this is not the end of this show, by the way, this is just a plug partway through. We really like anybody who wants to volunteer. We can teach you how to be a volunteer docent. We could use help on setting up exhibits, cleaning exhibits. We really need help getting the fort cleaned up this year because of that windstorm. Yes,
We
ma'am.
need volunteer ghosts.
What's that?
Volunteer ghosts.
Ghosts? Yes.
They'll move in.
Some of these ghosts are
They come
costly.
and go on their own.
I lost my voice hanging out with the paranormal people for 6 months. It was a drag. Go ahead, next slide, Tony. So, just want to let you guys know a little bit about the fort. I mean, I see the fort, and I'm biased. I work there. But the fort was something that was really an attraction for me when I moved here. It was the natural beauty that mainly attracted me. But then I got to see the whole county and visit the communes over in Gardner. I thought that was cool. Seeing this museum and the mining museum. It just, we have some amazing history here that's connected into a lot of other amazing history. But our visitation is really going up. In 2018, we had 1,111 people, we think. It's really hard to count people when we have a festival and we have different gates open and there's people coming in. But I know with Sandy Dolak had a table with a counter, and she's like, choo, choo, choo. She counted like about, between her and our gift shop, we counted 800. We know there was more than that. And then Francisco Days also brings in a lot of people to Fort Francisco Days. But look at that, we doubled visitation in 2019. And we were pretty sure one reason it was down in 2018 was because of the fire. We were closed during the peak of the season. We know it impacted businesses. But we had that many visitors in 2019. Texas has always been the #1 source of tourism in this area, all the way back to the early 1900s. Matter of fact, we found a box, Nancy Christopherson was cleaning up a storeroom a couple years ago. We found a box of these old glass slides. They're about the size of the screen on a cell phone. And I'm trying to round up a projector so we can show these things, but some of them are black and white, but they're slides promoting Levita and Cuchara as a tourist destination, and Walsenburg too. And so they have wagons with all these signs on them, trout fishing, relax, fresh mountain air, come to Levita, come to Walsenburg, come to Cuchara. And so I'd like to be able to do a slide program, but we have to buy what's called a Magic Lantern slide projector, which are hard to come by because they haven't made them since the early 1900s, but they're really cool, and we have a whole box of them. And then again, Texas and Oklahoma, or Texas is always number one. Until this past year, Colorado finally surpassed Texas almost by double. So we're getting a lot more visitation from Colorado. And the reason I mention that is it ties a lot into what's happening in our county. The Scenic Highway of Legends, being a state scenic highway, is getting more and more attention through that travel stories. The Creative District idea for downtown Levita is bringing a lot of people here. The county, Max Fazzani can talk about this with you after we hired a company called, because I'm on the tourism board, but the county hired a company called VistaWorks out of Buena Vista, and they're doing the Spanish Peaks Country destination tourism for our county. That's bringing in people. We've had a lot more people lodging here in the past year. So those are all happening. You might have heard that Highway of Legends is also proposed to become a federal scenic byway, which would make it even more, encourage more visitors, which could include marketing, interpretive centers, parking, more pullouts. You could, with a bike trail and foot trail that could go around the entire highway. So that's another thing. And there's also this thing called the Southern Mountain Loop, which ties into that. You might know that Colorado has a trail system called the Front Range Trails that runs from Wyoming all the way to New Mexico, but it's not all done yet. The last major part is our section, and it's the only part that doesn't basically run north and south as a trail system. This is going to be a loop around Highway 12 and hook us into Trinidad and down to Raton. So with the Fishers Peak State Park coming in, Scenic Highway of Legends going from a state highway to a, this isn't positive yet, but most likely to a federal scenic byway, the Creative District, all those things coming together. I think Levita and Huerfano County are on the cusp of seeing some really neat historical and what they call heritage and recreational tourism, which is great because currently tourism is our number one source of revenue in this county. Max might be able to correct me, but I believe tourism and agriculture. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's true for the state of Colorado. Colorado agriculture and tourism are always neck and neck for the number one resources of income in the state. So, at any rate, in 2019 we also had people from 39 different states visited us, and then the following countries. And so we're really, I see the fort as the heart and soul of Levita, and I really think it's a super important asset to the county. I think the citizens realized that back in the 50s when they decided to turn it into a museum. And like I said, aside from being the only original adobe fort, we have more structures than most other museums. We have 8 structures. We have the largest collection of Native American coins in the state. We have so many we can't even put them all out because some of them are so rare and valuable. Like one point could be worth like $10,000. That's because it's 12,000 years old and people want them. So we've had a lot of stuff stolen out of the museum. If we put those out, they get stolen. So we need like cases with alarms so that we can, we have probably 20% to 30% of what we have in the museum is in storage because we can't display it all. So we move the exhibits around. So that's when we often need help is people say, hey, we need 4 or 5 people, we're going to move everything out here, we're going to create a new exhibit. Because we have a lot of Native American stuff, a lot of Spanish and Hispanic history items I'd like to pull out and rotate them out. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
Oh,
Fort attracts many unique visitors. We had Jonathan here in the front row 2 years ago called me and said, Bob, he was walking down Oak Street, said, Bob, I just saw a sow, black bear, and her cubs jump the fence in the alley behind the fort, on the south side of the fort. So it was like, you need to tell the guests, I mean, deer are one thing, bear are another. So, anyway, I thought, well, I also grabbed my camera, I gotta get pictures of this. And I was running around the corner, around the west wing, and the first time I come around, there's the mama bear, right there. Go back around, you get excited. And then the Jeep kind of took off, I had more pictures of her. So these were the two cuts. They were trying to figure a way to get up on the roof of the blacksmith shop. They couldn't figure it out. And so, anyway, we have some more visitors on the next slide. Some other unique visitors. This isn't my slide, by the way. This is done by somebody before, an anonymous web designer dude named Ken Wilson. Yeah. His wife was a previous director, but they somehow rounded up this lady to get there for a picture. And next one. And questions or comments, and this is Will Prater. Will Prater is on our board. Tony is currently on our board, for the museum, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But Will Prater is one of the older families in the area, and he often does some things where he dresses up as a mountain man, but he was married to a Cherokee woman and learned how to set up a teepee, almost. And Will has told us that his wife, just like in America and most countries, the women are head of the household, and the teepee belonged to the woman, and that's why to this day, when men and women get divorced, the women usually get the house, right? Same. So, at any rate, they did own the teepee, but a woman alone could set that teepee up in 15 minutes to a half hour. It takes Will with Larry, who's also on our board. He's part of the Patterson family, which are part of the Georgia colony that's settled here. And it takes us, with 3 or 4 of the guys, about 2 to 3 hours to, what do you think, Tony? You've helped set it up.
Yeah, 3 to 6
So, lots of injuries, not groaning and stuff, but and Will often says that it would make a better funnel if it was upside down once we. But before we close, I just wanted to mention, there's the neat thing about this museum, I think, is that there's so many families that have been here for generations. So, Edna, we've got Malia. You're related to those people too, aren't you? Connor? Yeah. This guy comes to the museum all the time. And, but again, if it wasn't for the people recognizing what a treasure the structure was, and then recognizing how much importance the artifacts were in our history, so we could tie all this together. I mean, when you consider that, when Saran St. Vrain, being some of the very largest property owners in the history of this country, they own like 93,000 acres down here. That's a big chunk of land. And so, at any rate, I think that recognizing all those things to make this come together as a museum, and the support we're seeing for the Heritage Center, which John Van Kuren runs, and the Mining Museum, we really have an incredible amount of heritage here that's worth preserving and sharing with people. And that's a lot of tourists when they come, they want to know that. So what happened here? What's so big about Levita? And we can tell them about the famous bank robber, Black Jack Ketchum, who was, used to do the haunts in this area and robbing banks. And we can tell them about all these other things. But right now, the Mercantile, there's a group working on getting it historical status, state status. So, that's basically it. If anybody wants to hang out and talk, I have a lot of information here on the Georgia colony, which were some of the early settlers here. It's kind of like, where did everybody else come from? When the railroad came, and then right around that same time, after the Civil War ended, we had a huge number of people coming to fight, head back south to fight in the Civil War, but they were captured by Union soldiers and said, where are you guys going? So, you're going to go fight in the Civil War. Said, no, you're going to stay here in this fort for several years. And then when they got out, and some of them made it home, they didn't have any home to go back to. So the Georgia colony ended up being some of the first settlers in this area, and I like to mention that because really, if it wasn't for some of those circumstances of the Civil War and having these people who lost their homes in the South, they were, a lot of them were in the area doing gold and silver mining in the mountains west of Denver and along Cherry Creek. And when they came pouring down here through what was New Mexico, and they got stopped by soldiers, if that hadn't happened, Levita may not have grown into the community that it is. And we're kind of lucky to have this gentleman here, Larry Patterson, who's part of that, and John Chandler, part of that family, who have volumes of history that they come and share with us at the museum and at performances. So, but anyway, I have more notes and other things. We have a lot of books back there if you want to look at them. But if you have any questions or comments, Sharon.
I just want to introduce our new president, is Manuel Mollis. I'm the vice president, so I can
New president!
It's a pleasure.
Treasurer, yay.
Speaking of that, before Bob introduced answer questions. We depend critically on donations, so if you enjoyed Bob's presentation, we have a donation jar at the
If you
back.
didn't enjoy it, still put it.
Yeah. Bob, go ahead.
So, thanks. Mr. Dirk?
You've given credit to a lot of people, which is what makes the fort what it is. A unsung heroine for us is Peggy Davis.
Oh, yes.
And if you look at the alley just next to the building here, about 20 years ago, it went right into the fort, and the well on the fort was on Mr. and Mrs. Cook's property. It was all private. You could not have access to it except if the owners of that land just permitted it. Peggy Davis didn't like that, and she was on the Historical Society board at the time. And so she permitted a easement, a public use easement to be placed on her property so that in perpetuity, theoretically, it was, there are certain circumstances where those can be eliminated, but it was the best way to make the Fort Plaza look like what it did. Because the parking, their garage was there, they would wash their cars there, the kids were playing there, and everything. It's private property, but it has a public use easement, as well as a facade easement on the property so that the fort looks contiguously the same. I just want to give credit for
I
Peggy
thank you,
Davis.
Tom. That's true. And Tom was the town lawyer at the time and helped draw up the papers to make
Yeah.
all that happen. And so that, and it does, so when you go into our plaza, although that whole warehouse is gone, at least what's left, that's now that private residence, it looks like part of the fort, and it's maintained as if it's part of the fort. And they're really good about it, like when we had the hailstorm, we had a lot of roof damage and stuff, they were on the phone talking with town board, town hall, Lori, like, so we need to make sure, you know, what kind of shingles are we gonna replace these with? It's shake shingles now. Shake shingles are, it's hard for me to say actually. But they're a fire hazard. But there's now these things called enviro shingles that we're looking at maybe using instead. They look just like a shake shingle, but they're synthetic and they're fire retardant. And they last a lot longer, and they cost less than shake shingles. So we're trying to get, but hardly, there's only one company that makes them. So we're trying, because we not only have to get a new roof on the gift shop, which blew off in some wind, and then we had the hailstorm, and then we have these other winds, and so we're getting, several of the roofs are all getting replaced on the fort over the next year. So, any other questions or comments or news? I see other families back there, like the Arnolds, and who's that lady with Nancy? You guys have some history, have anything to add, any questions, anything I might have learned mistakes, like missing Peggy Davis or Sandy White, anything to add?
Explain the Georgia division you're talking about.
The Georgia colony?
Colony.
Yeah, I've got something here on them. Again, basically, got it in here, the Georgia colony. And a lot of it is kind of what I was just saying. These guys, there was this guy named William Green Russell. And if you go over Levita Pass, as you drop down, you'll see, and you're kind of curving around, and just as you get a little bit past where old Levita Pass comes in, you'll see a bunch of buildings on the right-hand side. That's Ute Creek you're traveling along. And that was a town that's named after him called Russell, or Russell's Gulch. And he was a guy who kind of preceded, if it wasn't for him becoming buds with the colonel, the Georgia colony might not have happened. Because he came out when the gold rush was happening along Cherry Creek in Denver and in the mountains west of Denver. And a lot of the people he brought out, they were all miners from Georgia and the Carolinas. And so these people, you know, they knew how to find stuff, they knew how to mine gold. So they came out for that. But then when the Civil War happened, they were going back, because when that capturing happened, and they were basically were forced to stay at Fort Union during the Civil War. And then once they were free to travel, again, they found out that they didn't have any place to go back to. So then what happened is Russell started literally working with the colonel and brought, like, you heard about a lot of the wagon trains. Brought wagon train of people were coming here, because there was also some theories that there was a lot of gold and silver and stuff in here, in our area. But there's, a lot of people lost a lot of money trying to find gold and silver and stuff around here. And there's several old mines up on the West Spanish Peak.
President Lincoln's son is one of them.
President, we even have a painting, yeah, President Lincoln's son had a gold mine up there. And so, but there are other valuable things, but really for the most part, coal was the big thing here, and not gold and silver and copper and other things. But at any rate, Russell settled on Apache Creek, which is north of, it crosses right around I-25. You might have heard about Apache Falls, which is a beautiful waterfall in the wet mountains. That's where he settled. And then he also encouraged an old friend named Decatur, Kate Patterson, the Patterson family, Larry Patterson and his wife, to come out. And they just kept prospecting, and they did find gold over in Russell, and that's kind of where he got to start. But he was considered, if you look up Colorado legends, Russell Greene's one of them, because not only was he one of the discoverers of gold in a lot of places, but he got a lot of people to come here as part of that Georgia colony. Let's see what else I have on him. So more than 140 years later, we still have, Georgia colony found here, Larry being an example. And the first post office here opened up in 1871, and Mr. Hamilton, not James Gillespie, but his brother Billy, Uncle Billy, he was the postmaster that I talked about that dug the dam. He was our first postmaster. So, and they weren't Georgia colony people; they were from Missouri. But these people started coming together. By the way, and John, being John here, you might be able to talk about there were some Indian problems that we talked about here, some attacks. And some of them were bad. I have copies of letters that were sent to Fort Garland and to the governor asking for help. And remember I talked about Hiram Vasquez being a more colorful character? I'll just kind of throw this out. Hiram Vasquez, and we have a great book on him back there, by the way, and it's really entertaining. It's written by a local woman named Ray Albright, and it's very well done. But Hiram Vasquez became the third partner. He was a squatter over here, and when Colonel and Dacre found him, they said, you're on our land? And they said, I'll be a partner. And so it's like, okay. And he lived to be quite old. And he went through, I think 6 wives and had all kinds of kids and stuff. But as a young boy, he was living at Fort Bridger at Wyoming-Utah border. And one day, he and some of the kids had gotten out, were playing outside the fort, which they weren't supposed to. And they got kidnapped. He got kidnapped by Indians. And they kept him for several years, so he was like 7 or 8 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, and he was living with the Indians for a long time. And he became the Indians, the chief, his favorite son. He was like royalty. He was like a prince to this chief. And he had everything. I mean, he had long white hair with all kinds of, gemstones and things in his hair. And one day, the Indians were then going to Salt Lake City to do some trading, and he wanted to go. Hiram did. And because his family never found him, and he was with them for these Indians for quite a few years, 5 or 6 years. And anyway, all the Indians went to town, and he snuck in after them. And so he's walking around town. It's like a young teenager, preteen almost, and people said, "Who's that white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Indian kid?" How do you fit in? So they kidnapped him back, and found out that he was the kid that had disappeared from Fort Bridger. And remember, and just a second, can you add to that? You guys saw the movie The Revenant that came out a few years ago? Leonardo DiCaprio won an Academy Award for his portrayal. That's all a true story. And one of the 2 guys of the last ones to abandon Grant, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, is Mr. Bridger, Jim Bridger. And so Hiram Vasquez knew the Bridger family, what's now the Jim and Levita, it was the Spur Theater back in the early 1900s, and there was a film being shown about Jim Bridger, and in it they portrayed him as a drunk, and Hiram Vasquez got mad because he knew him, and he stood up in the theater and said, "This is a bunch of crap. I knew Jim Bridger. He was never a drunk," and he stormed out of the theater. I think these are great stories that Hiram Vasquez. Yes, ma'am.
On subject of Hiram Vasquez, apparently he missed his life with the Indians.
Yeah.
So he would go back and just live with them for a while and then, re-enter, white society.
Well, he was valuable to the colonel because he could speak Spanish, he could speak Native American and English, and that's why when they were surrounded by Indians, by Kaniache, they said, "Hiram, get on your burro, on your mule, rather, and go get help." He went all the way to Fort Lyon, right? It's a Fort Lyon? 120 miles? It's like, I'll be back, Yeah, Kenny. Which tribe kidnapped? Let me see if I have that. It's
Chief Shawano up in,
yeah,
uh,
they weren't Shoshones. Were they?
yeah, Shoshones.
Shoshones, yeah.
Shoshones is what kidnapped him. So, but Hiram was valuable that way. I just came across a book. I'm hoping to get it for the museum next year. about a British woman who got kidnapped by Native Americans, by Greenhorn, Green Verde, and he made her his interpreter. And a lawyer in Denver has just written a book about her because she ended up living with him for a long time, and because she could speak English, she, I think she was just proficient in language. She could speak Spanish, and she learned how to speak various Native American dialects. And so somebody has dug up all this information on this woman who, a lot of times you get, that happened all the time. There was, even around here, when I talked about the Indians attacking, a lot of times it was like, they just came in like, let's kidnap this kid. Let's kick this woman. Let's burn the house down and take these horses. So, yes, sir.
Weren't the Indians residents here before the Spanish came?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Do you have any history on those people?
Yeah, in the fort, we do have a Native American room with those points, and we do have some history about Chipeta and Chief Ure being here, and Kaneache, that Johnston has a fabulous program on Kaneache. And we occasionally, every year or two, the Ute tribe from the Southern Mountain Utes and down around Durango and Ignacio and all that, they have a cultural program where they take about 15 to 20 teenagers and with a bunch of adults, and they take a tour of Colorado and they visit various Native American sites that were part of their land, and they basically have, like, we gave them a presentation, and it's kind of awkward because it's like, yeah, oh yeah, we're the people that took your land here. And a lot of them were still pretty pissed about it, I can tell you. There was a lady who was like, when I said, oh, they came in and they bought this land, like, they stole the land! All right, somebody stole it, but the colonel bought it. But we do have information about that. And there was other early Spanish settlements here before the colonel. It's Tom can probably talk about this. There was a fort on what was called Sangre Cristo Pass. Allegedly, there was a fort up there, an old Spanish fort, and there's lots of tales about. John Van Kuren can probably also talk about, as we're visiting afterwards, about people claiming they found cannons and stuff. We heard there was a garrison around here where they stored, Spanish stored some weapons around here, but David Steppen claims that, a local historian claims that's true. But yeah, the Utes were the main Indians here, but there were Apaches. And we do have Juan Batiste de Anza's journal from when he did his Apache campaign of 1779, and where he came up, and there, I don't have, there's 2 maps that were made of his journeys, more than 2. Manuel's seen all of them and stuff, but we have a, if you know about that, he was basically, Quena Verde was running amok here, and the Spanish could not settle here because Quena Verde, anytime anybody came in to settle, he ran them out. He kidnapped the women and the children and killed the men and burned things, take the horses, take the cattle, all done. And so finally, after numerous attempts for setting up the Spanish armies from Santa Fe, basically along I-25, but if you're a Native American and you're living here, you own all this land, control all this land, and actually the Apaches had taken a lot of it from the Utes, and Quena Verde had scouts all over the place, and he had like 500 guys coming up like dirt I-25, it makes quite a dust plume. And then it's like, Quena Verde say, I don't think those guys like us. I think we should get out of here. And they'd split, and they'd come and there'd be nobody to fight. So then the soldiers would go back, and finally they contacted Juan Batiste de Anza, who's famous for settling San Francisco, and was the first governor of Sonora, I think.
He wasn't a governor in Sonora. He's the first governor of New Mexico.
New Mexico,
New Mexico. He was just head of the military in
Right.
Sonora.
And he, but anyway, they got him, and he was a brilliant military strategist, and he said, you guys are doing this all wrong. Don't go up I-25, everybody goes up I-25. That's what he called it back then. And he said, go up the back way, go up through the valley, through Taos, go up through the San Luis Valley. So that's what he did. He got 600 men, 600 horses, wagons, artillery, all this stuff, food supplies. He said, we're going to travel at night, and we're going to go along the San Juans, and we're not going to have fires. So we travel at night, they can't see a dust plume, we're not going to have any fires. And they went up all through the San Luis Valley, up and over Poncha Pass. They were out of food. They found a herd of buffalo, slaughtered a bunch of buffalo. They came around up over what they think is Trout Creek Pass, I think is one of the theories. I don't know if they know, some of the routes are not exact, but one theory they came over Trout Creek Pass, came down the front range. Go ahead and add something in there, Manuel.
Well, they went by Manitoba Springs, down right through there.
Right, Manitou?
Manitou.
Manitou Springs.
Sorry.
And So, yeah, I wish we had a Manitoba Springs. But anyway, they came that way, and then they weren't expecting to come from the north, and a bunch of De Anza's men, or Anza as they call them, found some of the scouts. They captured them, tortured them, said, "Where's Queen Verde?" And then a battle occurred at the base of Greenhorn Mountain.
Right.
Nobody knows exactly where it's at. But
We could give a salon on this.
we could, and there's
Yeah.
some great people to do it, like you. So it's a
It's a
amazing story.
fascinating
They really, had that battle not happened in 1779, who knows what would have happened here. I mean, it was, that was when, the United States was becoming a country. And over here, we're still battling the Spanish, we're battling Indians because nobody could settle here. So it's, we have some of that history books on De Anza over there, and we have a whole section on Native American literature. And then again, with Sandy's Watoya Heritage Festival, we try to invite different Native Americans to come in to share art, culture, history. And then same thing when the Ute Cultural Group came in, Sandy was around for that. So I personally, my predecessor, Kim McGee, she really was well connected with Native Americans because she and her husband used to work on reservations, I think, teaching music and things. And she brought in all kinds of great Native American people, and I'd like to see more and more of that.
And her father is Kootenai Salish from Montana.
Right.
So she is Native American.
Right, blonde hair, blue eyed.
Yeah.
So, Kenny, did you have anything else you wanted to add in or any questions? Anybody else?
I
Sharon?
just wanted to recognize John Van Kuren because he identified all of those points one summer. And where is John?
He's in the very back.
Way back. He came in and volunteered all of his time to identify every one of those points when Kim was still the director.
Right.
So thank you, John.
And Tom?
Well, actually, a professional archaeologist, Mark Mitchell, spent 2 days identifying them, but they had to be labeled first, and I think John helped label them. And all that.
He was very involved in that. And also our Heritage Center is open Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays from 2 to 5 and Thursdays from 11 to 3.
And we have brochures downstairs. The library is kind enough to let us put museum brochures, and it lists the hours of the Mining Museum, the Fort, and the Heritage Center. So you can go in. And John is an amazing resource. I think we should give him a hand, not only for his point. John has done an enormous amount of research, but a lot of people think, so what else was the attraction here? Well, the Santa Fe Trail and the Taos Trail came right through here. I mean, the Taos Trail is right out on 520, just right outside of town. The mountain branch of the Santa Fe Trail is right up there by Walsenburg. And so this was a crossroads. It's been a crossroads for a long time. Very important area. Could you have something, or we? No, you're just doing. Tell me. Shut up, Bob.
I just had one bit of housekeeping and an invitation to everybody here. If you think the museum is an important and worthwhile thing to have here, and you're interested in its future, right now it's on fantastic footing. Bob's done tons of work over the past 4 or 5 years to put it on the fantastic footing, and it's right, like Bob was saying, the whole county, it's on the cusp of going into something really, truly wonderful and worthwhile. So the tradition's carrying on. Unfortunately, several board members on the museum board are not carrying on, and so there are several open spots there. So if you're interested in being part of that sort of next phase that the museum's now all teed up for, do let Town Hall know if you want to volunteer to be on the board there as well.
Thanks, John.